She was building a shelter with broken boards when the morning fog still clung to the valley like it didn't want to see what she was doing. Like the land itself, was ashamed to watch a woman who had already buried too much kneel in the mud and hammer splintered wood together with hands that shook from cold, grief, and hunger. And every strike of the rusted hammer echoed across the empty acreage as if calling out to someone who would never answer. Because her husband was dead, and the house he had promised to finish before winter was nothing but a blackened foundation now, the fire having taken everything except the land and the memories and the debt. And she worked silently, jaw clenched, breath shallow, hair pulled back with a strip of torn cloth because there was no one left to care how she looked. Only boards scavenged from a collapsed barn, nails bent and reused, plastic sheeting flapping like a wounded bird, and the sound of boots behind her that she noticed only after the shadow stretched long enough to fall across her hands. And she did not turn, not at first, because she already knew who it was. She had felt him there for weeks in the way the air tightened whenever she stepped outside, in the way the trees seemed to lean toward the road, in the way grief had learned a new shape since the funeral. And when she finally looked up, wiping sweat and dirt from her face, he was standing just beyond the reach of the hammer, her dead husband's brother, watching her with an expression that never quite settled into pity or anger or kindness, just that familiar stillness that had always made her uneasy even when her husband was alive. The stillness of a man who carried his words like stones in his pockets and never threw them. His name was Samuel, though everyone called him Sam, and he had been there the day she met her husband. There at the wedding, standing in the back with his arms crossed. There at the hospital when the baby they lost was declared stillborn. There at the funeral with his hat pressed to his chest, and his eyes fixed on the coffin as if daring it to move. And now here he was again, silent, as she built a shelter out of what the fire and the bank and the town had left her. And she felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, the urge to scream at him to stop staring, to help or leave, to say something, anything, because his silence felt heavier than judgment, heavier than the whispers she heard when she walked into town, heavier than the looks she got at the feed store where credit had long since dried up. But instead she turned back to her work, because she had learned that asking for help only made the fall harder when none came. And the hammer rang again and again until a nail bent sideways and split the board clean in two. And she swore under her breath, the sound raw and broken. And that was when Sam finally moved, not closer, not to take the hammer, just enough to shift his weight as if he might speak, and she froze. Because some part of her still remembered the sound of his voice, low and careful, and how her husband used to joke that Sam only spoke when the truth was too heavy to carry alone. But no words came, only the wind, only the crows, only the ache in her arms and the deeper ache in her chest where love used to live. And she stood up too fast, dizzy, the world tilting. And for a moment she thought she might fall, thought she might let herself fall just to see if anyone would catch her. But she steadied herself against the half-built wall, pressing her forehead to the rough wood, breathing in the smell of smoke that still lingered months after the fire, and she said without turning, "If you're here to tell me to leave, you're too late." And the words surprised even her with how flat they sounded, because she had rehearsed anger in her head for weeks. But grief had worn it smooth, and Sam did not answer, and that hurt more than if he had shouted, because silence had become the town's favorite weapon. Silence when she asked about work, silence when she asked for extensions, silence when she asked if anyone had seen the truck that night, silence that followed her like a curse, and she laughed then, a short, bitter sound, and said, "Of course," because what else was there to say, and she went back to work, hands numb now, nails biting into her skin as she forced them into place, and with every motion memories rose uninvited. Of her husband promising this land would be theirs, that no matter what happened they would always have a place to stand, of his laugh when the first wall went up, of his hand on her back guiding her forward. And she felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes and refused to let it spill, because tears did nothing but blur the work, and winter did not wait for grief. And somewhere behind her Sam watched, his face unreadable, his hands clenched at his sides as if fighting the urge to move, to help, to confess. Because there was something in his eyes that she had seen before but never understood, something like regret sharpened into purpose. And the sun climbed higher, burning away the fog, exposing the shelter for what it was, crooked and fragile and barely enough, and the land for what it had become, a scar where a home once stood, and the woman for what she was now, a widow building survival out of ruin while the man who knew more than anyone else stood silent. And when the hammer finally slipped from her grip and fell into the mud, she let it lie, straightened slowly, and turned to face him fully for the first time, their eyes meeting in a moment that stretched thin with everything unsaid. And she saw it then, not clearly, not yet, but enough to unsettle her, enough to make her heart stutter. Because grief recognizes guilt the way fire recognizes fuel, and Sam swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as if the truth were pressing against his teeth, and still he said nothing, and she shook her head, exhaustion washing over her, and said quietly, "If you're going to stand there, at least tell me why." And the question hung between them, unanswered, as heavy as the sky before snow. And this is where the story begins, where silence becomes a choice and watching becomes a burden. And if you want to know what truth can do when it finally breaks, when it costs everything it touches, then stay with this story, because what comes next will change how you see loyalty, love, and sacrifice. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about ordinary people carrying extraordinary weight, then subscribe to this channel and walk with us through the rest of this journey, because some truths take time and some stories are worth staying for. The truth did not come all at once. It never does. It crept in the way rot creeps through wood, quietly, invisibly, until one day the structure can no longer hold its own weight. And that was how it happened after she asked him why. Because Sam did not answer then either, not right away. He stood there while the wind pulled at the plastic sheeting and the cold settled deeper into the ground, and something in his face finally broke. Not dramatically, not with tears or raised voices, but with a small, defeated exhale that sounded like a man letting go of the last thing keeping him upright. And he said her name for the first time since the funeral, and hearing it from his mouth felt like reopening a wound that had scabbed over wrong. And she flinched despite herself, and he took a step closer, then stopped, as if an invisible line lay between them that he no longer knew how to cross. And he said he hadn't come to tell her to leave, that he had come because he couldn't stand it anymore, watching her tear herself apart board by board while he carried something that belonged to her, something she deserved to know. And she laughed again, sharp and hollow, because grief had taught her to expect disappointment. And she told him if he was here to offer sympathy, he could save it. That sympathy didn't keep the snow out or the bank away. And that was when he finally looked at the ground, when his shoulders sagged and his hands opened like he had been holding onto something burning. And he told her it wasn't sympathy, it was guilt. And the word landed between them like a dropped tool, heavy and dangerous. And she felt her pulse quicken, anger rising at last, hot and focused. Because guilt meant involvement and involvement meant answers, and she demanded he explain himself. Demanded he stop speaking in half-shadows and say what he came to say. And Sam nodded slowly, as if bracing himself, and began at the only place he could. The night of the fire, the night her husband died. The night that had replayed in her dreams so many times she thought she had memorized every second. And yet as he spoke, the shape of that night began to shift, details bending, familiar landmarks turning unfamiliar. Because Sam told her he had been there earlier than anyone knew. That he and his brother had argued in the yard while she was in town buying groceries. Argued about money, about selling the land, about walking away before the debt swallowed them whole. And she felt her chest tighten because she remembered that argument now, remembered coming home to tension she hadn't understood, remembered her husband snapping at her for no reason. And Sam said the argument got ugly, that words were said that couldn't be taken back. And when her husband stormed into the house, Sam followed, still trying to convince him to leave, to take the offer Sam had secured with a developer who wanted the land. And she shook her head, whispering that none of that mattered now, but Sam's voice trembled as he said it did matter. Because the fire started in that moment, not by accident, not by faulty wiring like everyone believed, but by a lantern knocked over in anger, a careless motion fueled by pride and desperation. And she felt the world tilt as she realized what he was saying, realized the truth he was circling. And she whispered her husband's name like a plea, like denial could still change the past. And Sam said he tried to put it out, that he grabbed a blanket, that he yelled for his brother to get out, but smoke filled the house too fast. Panic took over. And when the roof began to creak, he ran, not because he wanted to, not because he didn't love his brother, but because fear makes cowards of even the strongest men. And he stood outside, choking and helpless, watching flames eat the life they had built while his brother screamed inside. And the sound of that scream, Sam said, would follow him until he died. And she felt something inside her snap, something fragile that had been holding her together. And she staggered back, bile rising in her throat, because this was not the story she had lived with, not the story she had mourned. And Sam continued, voice breaking now, saying he told the fire chief it was an accident, that he told the town the same thing. Because if the truth came out, the insurance would deny the claim, the bank would seize the land immediately, and her husband would be remembered not as a man who fought the fire, but as a man who caused it. And Sam couldn't let that be his legacy, couldn't let that be what people whispered when they said his name. So he stayed silent, carried the lie and watched her lose everything piece by piece. And when he finally stopped talking, the silence that followed was different from before, heavier, alive, vibrating with pain. And she felt tears spill freely now, hot and unstoppable, because grief had changed shape again, sharpened by betrayal and twisted by understanding. And she screamed at him then, screamed that he had no right to decide what she deserved to know, that his silence had cost her her home, her dignity, her trust in the world, and Sam did not argue, did not defend himself. He simply nodded, tears streaking his face as he said she was right, that he would take whatever punishment she chose, that he would tell the truth if she wanted, even if it meant losing everything he had left. And the idea stunned her because she had imagined this moment ending with rage alone, not with choice, not with power placed back into her hands. And she looked at the shelter she had built, at the crooked walls and fragile roof, at the life she had pieced together from ashes. And she realized something then, something bitter and freeing, that the truth would not give her back what she lost, but it could give her something else, something she had been starving for without knowing it, agency. And she told Sam to leave, told him she needed time, and he obeyed without question, walking away with the same heavy steps he had arrived with. And that night she sat alone in the shelter, wrapped in borrowed blankets, listening to the wind claw at the walls, replaying his words over and over until they lost their sharp edges and settled into a dull ache. And by morning she had made her decision, because survival had taught her that living on a lie was another kind of death. And she went into town, to the insurance office, to the bank, to the fire chief, and she told them the truth, all of it, and the fallout was immediate and brutal. The claim denied, the land seized, Sam arrested and charged, the town buzzing with a new kind of whisper, one that finally included her voice. And she stood in the courthouse hallway days later as Sam was led past her in cuffs. And he stopped, looked at her, and said he was sorry, and she nodded. Not because forgiveness had come easily, but because truth had, and months later, when winter passed and spring softened the land, she stood on a different piece of ground, smaller, humbler, but hers, building again, not alone this time, because help had come from unexpected places, from people who respected honesty even when it hurt. And as she drove the first nail into new wood, she felt something close to peace, not because everything had been fixed, but because it was real. And if you've stayed with this story to the end, if you believe that truth matters even when it costs everything, then this channel is for you. Subscribe and keep walking with us through stories that don't flinch from pain but still make room for hope. Because sometimes the hardest shelters to build are the ones inside us, and those stories are worth telling.